I don't remember the exact moment my love for cars first took hold of me. Maybe it was the day my dad drove home in an old 1967 Chevrolet Impala, peeling with age but still purring proudly in the driveway. I was just a kid then, maybe 10 years old, but the sound of it stuck with me. The deep rumble of the engine, echoing in my chest like thunder before a storm, has never left me to this day. Ever since I was a kid, I've been drawn to garages, tools, and anything that involves fixing things. I could spend hours watching my neighbors tinkering under the hoods of their cars with wrenches and rags, and the smell of oil, gasoline, and hot metal seemed better to me than any perfume. My dad once took me to the garage of his neighbor, Mr. Henry, a Vietnam veteran and a jack of all trades. He was rough around the edges, but when it came to cars, he was almost magical. I watched his hands deftly remove parts, unscrew nuts, and tenaciously grip tools. It was as if the car and he understood each other without words. When I turned 16, I bought my first car, a 1972 Ford Mustang, a wreck. It cost me all my savings, earned from working part-time at a gas station and mowing neighbors' lawns. It had a rusty door, a cracked windshield, and, most importantly, a non-working engine. But that didn't scare me. On the contrary, I saw it as a challenge. Looking at that piece of metal, I felt a thrill, a desire to revive it, to breathe new life into it. The garage became my refuge. I spent every free minute with the Mustang. I took it apart, cleaned it, looked for parts in ads and at junkyards. Sometimes I was lucky enough to find something useful from friends. There were times when I was squeezing out the last of my money for a new part, but as soon as I screwed it into place, I was overcome with a feeling of victory. I remember one episode in particular. It was late summer, and it was so hot that my hands were slipping from sweat even in gloves. I was lying under the car, trying to install a new muffler, which turned out to be slightly larger than necessary. I was puffing and grumbling, but I did not give up. After an hour of torment, I finally secured it. I crawled out from under the car, covered in soot, dirt, and joyful fatigue. You should have seen me. But at that moment, I felt like a winner. The years went by. I changed several jobs, trying to find a stable income, but the thought of opening my own workshop did not leave me. I wanted to create a place where people could leave their cars and be sure that they would be treated not just as a piece of iron, but as a part of their lives. One day, at the gas station where I was working at the time, an elderly man pulled up to me in a Buick with a loud banging engine. He looked worried and didn't know what to do. I told him it was probably a connecting rod bearing and offered to take a look on the spot. He agreed, and in about 30 minutes I took apart part of the engine and confirmed the diagnosis. The old man was surprised that I had figured it out so quickly. Then he said that I had golden hands and that I should open my own workshop. These words hit the anvil in my head like a hammer. After that incident, the thought of my own workshop did not leave me. I began to save money, denying myself many things. I denied myself pizza on Fridays, replaced coffee from a cafe with homemade coffee, and went into town less often. It would seem like trifles, but I saw how these tiny savings slowly but surely turned into an amount sufficient for a serious step. One day, luck smiled on me. The local auto shop closed, and the space where it was located was put up for rent. I stood in front of the building, looking at the peeling sign and the old gates that had clearly seen better days. A strange feeling arose inside me, a mixture of fear and excitement. I knew that this was my chance. That night, I barely slept. I put all my savings on the kitchen table and counted them over and over. I wondered if I would have enough for the first month of rent, equipment, and bills. The amount was not ideal, but close enough to take a chance. Mr. Henry's words popped into my head. If you wait for the perfect time, it will never come. The next day, I signed the lease. The walls of the place smelled damp, the floor was covered in oil stains, and the air reminded me of Mr. Henry's old garage. It was not an ideal place, but it was mine, my workshop. The first months were difficult. I didn't have any big orders, and the locals weren't in a hurry to trust their equipment to a new mechanic. Doubts crept into my head, But every time I entered the workshop and saw my tools on the shelves, I felt strong. Gradually, the first clients appeared. I remember the case of one farmer who brought his old Ford F-150 with dripping oil. I fixed his punctured crankcase and did it so carefully that he didn't believe that I had done it in one day. He told his neighbors about my workshop, and they told their friends. This was the moment when I realized that my work was starting to bear fruit. Every day brought new challenges and small victories. Sometimes cars arrived that you couldn't look at without tears. But I didn't see piles of metal in them, but an opportunity to breathe new life. One day, a guy came with a funny problem. His Cadillac was making a strange whistling sound. He was sure it was something serious, but when I opened the hood, I found a stuffed pig stuck between the belts. The guy laughed for a long time, and then said that his kids must have put it in there when he wasn't looking. Stories like this made my job even more interesting. The months went by. With each order, I gained confidence. People began to return and recommend me to others. The garage that once seemed too big and empty to me was now filled with cars, tools, and the sound of work. I wasn't just fixing cars anymore. I was making a dream come true. Dirty hands and drops of oil on my boots became symbols of victory for me. This wasn't just a job, it was my life's work. Sometimes I still think about that old Mustang that started it all. That car taught me the main thing. If you can revive something that is dead, you can do anything. Sometimes it seemed to me that every car that came into my shop had its own character. Some were arrogant, capricious, others stubborn, like old mules. But each of them could be understood if you listened carefully. I always said to myself, if the car makes noise, it means it is talking to you. You just need to learn to listen. One day, a huge International 9400 truck pulled up to my shop, looking like it had just been pulled out of a swamp. Mud covered the cab and trailer in a thick layer, and from somewhere under the bottom there was an unpleasant creaking sound, like an old tree bending in the wind. The driver, a tall man in a cowboy hat, looked exhausted and irritated. He got out of the cab, looked around and gestured at his truck, as if asking, "Do something about this?" I immediately realized that it would not be easy. The creaking was clearly coming from the suspension, and the dirt made it difficult to inspect. I took a pressure hose, washed the wheels and frame to see what was going on. All this time, the cowboy stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, watching, as if assessing my abilities. I lay under the truck for almost 2 hours, figuring out where exactly that damn noise was stuck. In the end, it turned out that one of the stabilizer bolts was almost completely torn off. I replaced it and greased all the connections. When I asked the driver to check the car, he started the engine, drove a few meters, and abruptly stopped. He got out of the cab, nodded with a satisfied look, and left a tip that I did not even expect to receive. It was one of the first recognitions of my skills from a client, and it was moments like these that made me feel like a master of my craft. Working days in the workshop were rarely calm. Usually on Monday, I made a list of tasks for the week, but by Tuesday, there was not a line left. People would come unexpectedly. Someone's brake started screeching. Someone's car wouldn't start in a store parking lot. There was the case of one elderly woman, Mrs. Clark, who came complaining that the car was pulling sideways. It turned out that her front right wheel was barely held on by 3 bolts instead of 5. I didn't scold her. I just quietly did the job and explained that next time it would be better to immediately ask for help. But there were some really funny moments. One time, a high school student drove up to me in an old Honda Civic. He looked scared and worried. I asked him what was wrong, and he pointed to the hood. When I lifted the hood, I expected to see, as usual, an overheated engine or a broken belt. But instead, I found a bag of chips stuck between the drive belts. Apparently, the guy stopped at the store, threw the bag under the hood to free his hands, and forgot it there. The engine, of course, ground everything up, and the chips scattered everywhere. We both laughed for a long time, and I still remember this incident. Sometimes technology presented such surprises that you wanted to give up and go home. Like that time, I had to fix a Dodge Ram whose steering rack was jammed. At first, I thought it would be a matter of 3 hours maximum. But as soon as I unscrewed the first nut, everything went awry. One of the bushings was so firmly stuck to the frame that I had to cut it out with a grinder. Then I managed to drop a wrench on my foot, punctured a leather boot, and got a bruise on my finger. And when I finally got the job done and happily tightened the last bolt, I discovered that I had forgotten to reconnect the steering position sensor. I had to start almost from scratch. At those moments, I wondered why I got involved in this business at all. But every time I found an answer, because I could not imagine myself without it. Interesting cars also sometimes stopped by. One day, a man came to me in an old 1979 Pontiac Firebird, just like in the movies. The car looked amazing. Black body, gold eagle on the hood, exhaust pipes emitting a low, guttural roar. The problem turned out to be trivial. The manifold gasket began to leak air, and the engine sneezed. But I enjoyed working on this car. I've always had a soft spot for classic cars. Perhaps one of the most unusual customers was a local priest, Father Donovan. He drove up in a Chrysler Town and Country minivan, and I didn't even expect to see him in my shop. He was usually so calm and dignified, but here he was agitated. His check engine light came on, and he thought the car was giving signs. I hooked up a diagnostic tool and found out it was just a bad oxygen sensor. A trivial job, but while I was tinkering with the car, Father Donovan was telling me about the importance of listening to signs in life. I chuckled to myself, thinking that cars might give signs, but only through warning lights on the dashboard. Another incident was with a local mailman, Tommy. He pulled up in his company van and said there was something rattling in the back. While disassembling the back compartment, I found a small wooden box. Inside was an old kitten, which must have crawled in while the van was open. Tommy was shocked, but then he warmed up and took the kitten home. Sometimes I wanted to take a break, but the work in the workshop did not forgive weakness. There were days when I went home covered in oil, with a sore back and aching legs, but in my soul I felt satisfied. There was something special about getting people's cars back to working order. Seeing a customer get behind the wheel, turn the key in the ignition, and hear the smooth, confident purr of the engine was my personal triumph. My workshop came alive not only with cars, but also with stories. People shared with me their problems, life stories, and plans for the future. The car, as it turned out, was a part of these stories, and I became a kind of witness to their journey. Every evening, I locked the gate to the workshop and looked back at my tools, at the car left overnight for repairs, and at myself in the reflection of the window. Tired but happy. I couldn't ask for a better job. Sometimes I catch myself thinking that my life is like a car engine. There are moments when everything works smoothly and efficiently, like pistons and cylinders. And sometimes something jams, cracks, and requires urgent repair. But the most important thing is to never turn off the engine. Several years have passed since I opened my workshop. Years of work have resulted in scars on my hands and calluses on my fingers, but each scar was a sign to me that I was moving forward. During this time, my small workshop turned into a well-known place for our entire town. People were no longer afraid to leave their cars with me. Some customers became regulars, even stopping by just to chat and find out how I was doing. It was nice. One day, the same Mr. Henry who once showed me how to hold a wrench correctly came to see me. He had aged, his hair had turned gray, but his gaze remained the same, stern, piercing to the bones. He walked around the workshop, looked at the workbenches, rows of tools, racks of spare parts. Then he stopped next to me and nodded. It was not just a nod. It was a sign of recognition. But one of the most memorable moments of all this time was the day when an old 1967 Impala drove into my garage. Yes, the same model that my father once drove. The color was different, not blue, but dark green. But my heart sank. The man who drove this car said that he had recently bought it and wanted to restore its former appearance. I agreed to take on this. Working on the Impala became a matter of honor for me. Every evening after the main orders, I stayed late to work on it. I took the engine apart down to the last screw, cleaned and painted the parts, installed new pistons, and replaced the old cylinder head gasket. The exhaust system was almost completely replaced, but I tried to preserve the sound, that same deep rumbling roar that so fascinated me as a child. Sometimes I would just turn on the engine and stand next to it, listening. This sound took me back to the days when I was a boy looking at my father with admiration. Even then, I understood that cars are more than just metal. They are memory, a connection between generations. There were hard days, too. For example, that winter when my own compressor broke. Without it, I could not lift the cars on the lift. I tried to fix it myself, but after 3 days I realized that time was more precious. I took money from my stash and bought a new one. At first, it was a shame to spend the money I had saved with such difficulty, but when the new compressor buzzed like a happy bumblebee, I realized that I had made the right choice. The customers continued to please and surprise. I remember one guy in an old VW Beetle who came in complaining that his car was making a knocking noise around the rear wheel. When I got the car up on the lift, it turned out that he had a Coke can stuck in the trunk under the back seat. The can was rolling back and forth as he drove, creating the effect of a horrible malfunction. We both laughed until we cried when I showed him this breakdown. But there were also days when I wanted to quit. Like the day when a customer brought in a huge Chevrolet Suburban with a rattling rear axle. I spent almost 2 days on it. At first, I thought that it was just a bearing that needed to be replaced, but it turned out that the axle was slightly bent. I had to order a new part and postpone the work again. The customer grumbled and demanded that it be done faster, but I explained to him that quality is more important than speed. I managed to cope, but those 2 days were probably the most nerve-wracking in my career. And then came the recognition. One day I opened the mailbox near my house and found a letter. Inside was an envelope with the logo of the local newspaper. I thought it was an advertising flyer, but when I opened it, I saw my photo. My shop had been named Best Auto Shop of the Year by the readers of the newspaper. It was unexpected. At first, I just stood there and stared at the paper, not believing my eyes. I will never forget that moment. I even hung that clipping on the wall of the shop, next to a calendar and a photo of my first Mustang. People who came in read it and smiled. One day, a car pulled up to the shop that I could not forget. Ford Mustang 1972, an exact copy of the one I once fixed in my youth. The driver was a guy in his 20s. He said that he wanted to replace the brake pads and check the suspension. When I saw that car, a strange thrill came over me. It was like I was back in that garage, lying on the concrete floor, lifting the heavy suspension with my hands. I did the job with special care, as if I were fixing the car for myself. I checked the brakes, replaced all the worn parts, even lubricated the door hinges so they wouldn't squeak. The guy took the car and said it drives like new. But he didn't know that for me it was more than just an order. It was a moment of meeting myself. Looking back, I realized that I opened more than just a workshop. I discovered the meaning of life. It's not about money. It's not even about cars. It's about the people who trust you, about their smiles when they start the engine and hear the smooth purr of the engine. It's about a story that begins with one boy who fell in love with the sound of a Chevrolet Impala and continues years later in his workshop. Today, as I close the workshop gates, I run my hand over the metal and remember all the cars that have been here. Each of them left its mark. But most importantly, they left a mark on me. Dreams don't come true on their own. They need to be tightened, lubricated, tightened, and started again and again, like an engine after a long period of inactivity. But if you don't give up, then one day you will hear a smooth, confident roar under the hood. And then you will understand that your stand was not in vain. This is my life. A life full of the sounds of engines, the smell of oil, and the satisfaction of having done everything right.